Book of Judges, Israel's Age of Heroes.
Some of the most interesting characters in the Bible can be found in the Book of Judges. There's Samson, a renowned fighter who drew strength from his long hair. Shamgar, an obscure warrior who massacred the Philistines with an ox goad. Gideon, a general who defeated the invading Midianite army with just 300 soldiers. Deborah, a prophetess who delivered Israel from a Canaanite tyrant. Most of these characters are mentioned nowhere else in the Old Testament, and their stories seem rooted in legend and folklore. Furthermore, the Book of Judges itself is an enigma. When was it written? Where does it fit within the biblical chronology? And what historical reality underlies its mythic tales? Before moving forward, I ask that everyone watching this documentary subscribe to Paul Davidson's YouTube channel called Inquisitive Bible Reader. His channel is filled with amazing deep dives in discovering these ancient myths and histories from the Bible. Also, he wrote this fantastic script on the Judges. While you're over on his channel, let him know MythVision sent you.
Who were the judges?
If you were brought up in Sunday school, you were probably taught that the Book of Judges describes a period of time after the Exodus in which Israel was governed by judges instead of by kings. However, this is at odds with what we actually find in the Book of Judges. The Book of Judges is a collection of stories about Israel during a time when it was ruled by warriors and chieftains without a true monarchy. In its position between Joshua and Samuel, it fills in the chronological gap between the Exodus and the monarchy. In terms of format, the book has an artificial structure that repeats a similar pattern over and over. Israel sins and is punished by being subjugated to its enemies. Then Israel repents, and Yahweh sends a deliverer to throw off the foreign yoke, with the process typically repeating over a 40 or 80-year cycle. These deliveries are said, in most cases, to have judged Israel, so they get referred to as judges. The Hebrew word shafet, translated as judge in English Bibles, means what it sounds like: someone who is a judge in the judicial legal sense, who upholds law and order in the community. Problem is that the title doesn't fit very well. Unlike the judges appointed by Moses in Exodus and Samuel as depicted in 1 Samuel, none of the characters in Judges actually performs the duties of a judge. As Old Testament scholar Robin Baker observes in his 2016 book, quote, "None of the major or minor judges delivers a recorded judgment, nor with the arguable exception of Deborah is presented in the process of judging." Renowned scholar Martin Knopf also once wrote, "There is no demonstrable or even plausible meaning for the word judge which could apply to these heroes as we know them." End quote. Instead, these characters seem to be legendary war heroes whose exploits often come at the opportune time to deliver Israel from its enemies. Some of them, such as Gideon and Abimelech, are presented as political leaders as well, while others, like Samson, are nothing of the kind.
Judges, a book out of time.
When exactly are the events of the Book of Judges supposed to have happened? Traditionally, the narrative was taken more or less at face value. Readers assumed that it depicted the history of Bronze Age Israel, after the Exodus from Egypt and the conquest of Joshua, but before the monarchy. However, in modern times, this view has become untenable, both on historical grounds and biblical grounds. On the historical side, mainstream historians and archaeologists no longer think the Israelites were ever enslaved in Egypt or migrated as a nation to Palestine and conquered the Canaanites. The Israelites were simply Canaanites. They emerged from the Canaanite tribes and polities of the Bronze Age. They produced Canaanite pottery, spoke a Canaanite language, and practiced Canaanite religion. Historians also know quite a bit about conditions in Bronze Age Palestine, thanks to the Amarna letters, a 14th century Egyptian archive that includes numerous letters from various local rulers in Palestine, among them Abdi-Heba, king of Jerusalem. The situation these letters describe does not resemble anything we find in Joshua or Judges, and Canaan was under Egyptian governance during that period. The Merneptah Stele provides the earliest known historical reference to Israel near the end of the Bronze Age, around the year 1207 BCE. The inscription lists Israel, indicated by the hieroglyphs, as a tribe rather than a nation. Among the peoples defeated by the pharaoh Merneptah, this too challenges traditional biblical interpretation. Old Testament scholar Lester Grabbe observes that the inscription, quote, provides no evidence for any sojourn in Egypt for those identified in the text as Israel. The Israel mentioned there seems to be a people not yet settled, while the country is firmly under Egyptian control. The inscription does not presuppose an Israel, anything like that depicted in Joshua or Judges. And even just sticking with the biblical narrative, the period described in Judges covers at least 4 centuries, which is far too long a time to fit between the death of Joshua and the events of Samuel through Kings. Simply put, there's no period of actual history that correlates to the period of the Judges. Biblical literalists who try to fit the Judges into the biblical timeline generally resort to having numerous judges rule Israel concurrently, even though that is not the impression one gets from reading the book of Judges. Such timelines typically also ignore the many long periods of intermediate length during which Israel slowly forgets Yahweh and falls into idolatry. Simply put, there's no period of actual history that correlates to the period of the Judges.
Changing perspectives in Old Testament studies.
Throughout most of Western history, the Old Testament was regarded as a unique chronicle of historical events going back to the very creation of the world. Archaeological excavations in the 19th century, however, revealed the rich literary traditions of the Sumerians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, many of which had parallels in the Bible. In 1902, a German Assyriologist named Friedrich Delitzsch presented the revolutionary thesis that the myths in Genesis were derived from Babylonian precursors. This triggered a fierce debate between theologians and historians of the Near East, known as the Babel Bible controversy. In time, however, the dependence of the primeval history in Genesis on earlier Near Eastern myths became universally accepted, and for over a century, scholars have made great strides in their understanding of the Bible by studying the histories and legends of neighboring civilizations. In 1992, Danish Old Testament scholar Niels Peter Lemke triggered the start of a new era in biblical scholarship when he asked if the Old Testament was a Hellenistic book. As academia took a broader look at the dating of the Old Testament writings and their canonization, more and more connections with the literature and myths of the Greeks were discovered. While the Pentateuch received much of that attention early on, scholars soon turned their gaze to other books as well, including Judges. Still, while recent scholarship has entertained the possibility of a Hellenistic background for parts of the Pentateuch, scholars typically consider Judges to be part of the Deuteronomistic history. The books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which in their view dates to the exilic period and maintains a consistent theology about the covenant violation, rebellion, and apostasy that were the cause of Israel's destruction and exile under the Assyrians and Babylonians.
The Book of Judges, a Hellenistic invention?
Recent work by Philip Guillaume, a Bible scholar at the University of Bernay, Switzerland, suggests that Judges was not, in fact, an original part of the Deuteronomistic history. Guillaume believes Judges was compiled in its final form much later, during the Hellenistic period, meaning the era following the conquest of Alexander the Great, when Greek culture and literature was widespread. Furthermore, Guillaume has demonstrated that there is little or no awareness within the rest of the Old Testament of an extended, quote, period of the Judges, end quote, between Joshua's conquest and the time of Eli and Samuel. Several of the Psalms that summarize the history of Israel omit any mention of the Judges. Psalm 83 does mention several antagonists from Judges, but not any of the Israelite heroes. 1 Samuel 12:11, one of the only verses to mention the pre-monarchic period, shows familiarity with some of the names found in Judges, but not in a way that reflects the canonical stories we now possess. For example, it describes Samuel rather than Samson as the one who delivered Israel from the Philistines, and it mentions another hero named Gideon, who is unknown in Judges. Other possible Old Testament references, which are very few in number, are either ambiguous or show signs of later editing. Even Eupolemus, the first Jewish chronographer who wrote in the 2nd century BCE, goes straight from Joshua to Samuel in his summary of Israelite history. According to Gideon, the earliest reliable knowledge of a period of the Judges comes from the book of Sirach, written by a Jewish sage Ben Sira, most likely in Alexandria, Egypt, around the year 175 BCE. In fact, the Egyptian city of Alexandria, which was a major center of Greek culture and influence with a significant Jewish population, might have been where the book of Judges originated. Even if some form of the book existed prior to this, Gideon argues that it had not yet been adopted into the Jewish canon between Joshua and Samuel. Within the Bible itself, we also have evidence that Judges was only inserted after Joshua at a late date. The final verses of Joshua vary significantly between the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Greek Septuagint, suggesting that it was edited at a late stage to produce a better transition to the book of Judges. The Greek version in particular anticipates the forthcoming apostasy of the Israelites, a constant theme in Judges, and their subjugation by Eglon of Moab, which occurs in Judges 3. The end of Joshua in Hebrew has a more, quote, happily ever after, end quote, feel, with the promised land fully subdued and Israel fully committed to Yahweh and the teachings of Joshua. Similarly, the opening chapters of Judges, from chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 3 verse 11, seem to be later additions intended to improve the transition between the events of the two books. Emmanuel Tove, an expert on textual criticism, is of the view that Joshua and Judges began as a single book, and the opening chapters of Judges were added after the two books were split apart. Gideon, however, believes that these additions are better explained if Judges was an independent work that was later adapted into and fit between Joshua and Samuel. Perhaps the most telling sign that Judges was not part of any Deuteronomistic history is the fact that its depiction of the conquest of Canaan is so different from that of Joshua. While Joshua ends with the entire land conquered and divided among the tribes, Judges opens with the land still unconquered. Judges 3:2, part of an insertion intended to bridge this gap, states that Yahweh allowed the Canaanite nations to remain so that successive generations of Israelites could learn how to fight wars. But that doesn't explain everything. For example, why does Judges 18:1 say no territory had been allotted to Dan, when Joshua 19:48 through 46 clearly spells out the territory allotted to Dan? And why do Joshua and Judges disagree over whether Jerusalem was allotted to Judah or to Benjamin? In a 2009 paper, Dutch scholar Klaas Spronk points out numerous correspondences between Judges and Samuel. In every case examined, the story found in Samuel appears to be the more original one. This suggests that parts of Judges were written as a prequel to Samuel, with a strong pro-monarchic message. On this basis, Spronk also believes that Judges was composed during the Hellenistic age. He concludes, quote, somewhere in the early Hellenistic age, Jewish scribes collected and edited the prophetic and poetic texts and published them as rounded off, authoritative texts, as the legacy of inspired men like David and Isaiah. They also wished to offer an authoritative version of the history of Israel from the creation until restoration after the Babylonian exile. In this process, the book of Judges could very well have been their final masterpiece, end quote.
Hesiods Heroes.
At issue, however, is not just the lateness of Judges or the widespread presence of Greek stories and themes in the Old Testament. The very creation of the book of Judges established a new era in Israelite history, characterized by legendary heroes and warlords who carried out great feats in battle, oftentimes supernatural in nature. This is where Hesiod comes in. Hesiod was an ancient Greek poet and philosopher who lived around 700 BCE, roughly contemporary with Homer at a time when writing was first emerging in Greece. He is most well known for Theogony, a mythological account of the gods and creation, and for Works and Days, a long poem about labor, virtue, and wisdom. In Works and Days, Hesiod applies the metaphor of metals to different ages of humankind. There was the Golden Age, in which humans lived like gods, the Silver Age, in which humans had some vices but did not fight wars, the Bronze Age, in which humans began eating meat and fighting wars, and the Iron Age, which was the current age of mankind, an age of suffering and shorter lifespans. The metallic ages probably predate Hesiod, and the statue made of different metals from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2 is a direct allusion to them. The Greeks might have originally developed it from the Babylonian paradigm of primeval ages attested in the Song of Atrahasis. However, between the Bronze Age and Iron Age, Hesiod introduced a new age, the Heroic Age, in which Zeus created a new race of heroes to counter the increasing degeneration of humanity. Although these heroes still fought numerous violent wars, they were said to be more just than the warring men of the Bronze Age. Herodotus, the famous 5th century Greek historian, adopted Hesiod's heroic age in his reconstruction of history and placed it around 1200 BCE, which corresponds roughly to the cataclysmic end of Mycenaean civilization. According to Herodotus, the heroes of that age were greater than contemporary men and sometimes had unusual and fabulous powers. Hesiod's poems were part of the curriculum for those learning to write Greek in the Hellenistic age, and he was known to Jewish writers such as Josephus and the author of the Jewish Sibylline Oracles. In 2014, Old Testament scholar Philip Guillaume proposed that Hesiod's Age of Heroes served as a model for the period of the Judges, an age that was indeterminate in its original form, a story of ancient heroes and saviors floating somewhere between the primeval past and Israel's post-monarchic present. And like Hesiod's heroes, who took on greater moral responsibility than the men before and after them, the heroes of Judges also faced unique moral challenges with serious consequences. Samson, whose unparalleled strength was defeated by the wiles of a woman, and Jephthah, who sacrificed his own daughter for the salvation of Israel, are but two examples. For a Hellenistic Jewish audience, the heroes of Judges could be appreciated as both role models and cautionary tales, much like Hesiod's heroes. There's no way to know for certain if and to what extent the writers who compiled, composed, and edited the diverse stories found in Judges were influenced by Hesiod and Herodotus. However, with the exception of Othniel, the only Judahite judge, who seems to have been a separate addition to the Book of Judges, every hero of Judges has significant parallels with older Greek tales, suggesting the potential cultural and literary connections with Hesiod's heroic age and Hellenistic mythology in general should be taken seriously.
The ending of Judges.
In the works of Hesiod and Herodotus, the heroic age ends with the Trojan War. According to Herodotus, that war was the culmination of a series of abductions of women. First, the Phoenicians kidnapped the Greek priestess Io. Next, the Greeks kidnapped Europa, daughter of the Phoenician king, and Medea, daughter of the king of Colchis. A generation later, Paris, the son of Trojan king Priam, knowing that these previous kidnappings had gone unpunished, decided to kidnap a wife of his own. His abduction of Helen became the trigger for the bloody Trojan War. The period of the Judges ends in remarkably similar fashion, with violence and kidnapping involving women. In Judges 19, a Levite concubine is raped and murdered by some Benjamites. This provokes a bloody war between Benjamin and the other tribes that nearly exterminates the Benjamites, but also wipes out huge numbers of Israelites. The 600 Benjaminite survivors are left with no women to marry, and the Israelites refuse their request for wives. Out of pity, however, the Israelites attack the city of Jabesh Gilead and kidnap 400 women for the Benjaminite men. The Benjaminites then kidnap a further 200 female dancers from a festival at Shiloh to make up the remaining shortfall. There are also notable parallels between the kidnapping at Shiloh and the rape of the Sabine women, recorded by Plutarch and Livy. That myth tells how the men of early Rome lacked women to marry, so they sent out an embassy to other cities asking for women, much like the pleas of the Benjaminites for wives. The request of the Romans is rebuffed, so they wait for a religious festival which, much like the Shiloh festival, brings numerous virgin girls to the city. Then they descend on the festival and quickly snatch up girls to keep as wives. It cannot be proven, of course, that the author of Judges modeled the end of his narrative after the Trojan War and similar classical myths, but those stories in Judges do seem to be drenched in the same mythological themes.
The Mythical Heroes of Judges.
The heroes of Judges also seem to be based on Greek myths and legends to a greater extent than most other parts of the Hebrew Bible. While not proof of a connection between Judges and Hesiod's heroic age, the presence of such elements is consistent with what we would expect if Judges had been written with a similar purpose in mind. Shamgar. Let's start with the most obscure hero in Judges, a man named Shamgar. He's mentioned in only 2 verses. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anat, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. He too delivered Israel. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased and travelers kept too by the byways. These 2 scant verses provide a surprising amount of information. First, Shamgar is the son of Anat, who was well known as a Canaanite war goddess. Although scholars have searched for other interpretations, the general view is that this means just what it sounds like. In an often cited paper, the late Dutch scholar Adrianus van Selms wrote, quote, "In all texts where the name Anat occurs, Egyptian, Ugaritic, or Aramaic, it refers to the great goddess. Even the place names in the Old Testament are to be explained as originally denoting sanctuaries of this deity. Let us assume that the general rule also applies in this case, and therefore that Shamgar is indeed the son of the goddess Anat." End quote. It was quite common for a hero of the Greek heroic age to have a god or goddess as a parent. In the Bible, it is not so common, so Shamgar was apparently an extraordinary warrior. Classicist Bruce Loudon also argues for this interpretation, noting that some of the heroes who fought at Troy were also the sons of gods. Memnon, the son of the goddess Eos and human prince Tithonus of Troy, is perhaps a relevant example, and Anat, being a war goddess to the Egyptians, is a suitable deity to be associated with a war hero. Furthermore, we know from the Elephantine papyri that the ancient Israelites were among the nations who venerated Anat. Greek myths of semi-divine heroes bring to mind the Gibborim, the Hebrew Bible's term for warriors of old, men of renown, who in Genesis 6 were also the offspring of divine beings and human women. This ties into the Age of Heroes myth, because the story in Genesis 6, 1-4 is remarkably similar to the story told in Catalogue of Women, another ancient work often attributed to Hesiod. Catalogue of Women explains how the mating of gods and human women prompted Zeus to instigate the Trojan War, ending of the heroic age and destroying the demigods. Interestingly, the name Shamgar, an awesome name to be sure, is not a Hebrew name. Most commentators believe it is a theophoric Hurrian name, meaning Shemig has given. Shemig was the Hurrian sun god whose veneration extended beyond Anatolia to the Phoenician coast and western Syria, and the Hurrian name Shemigar is well attested. It appears then that the Book of Judges not only contains motifs from Greek historiography, but also heroes with non-Israelite origins. Now, Shamgar is remembered by the Book of Judges for one thing: single-handedly killing 600 Philistines with a makeshift weapon an ox goad. This tale is obviously an exaggeration, even if there is any history at all behind the legend of Shamgar. However, it is one of several feats in Judges and Samuel that fit the pattern of an Aristia. What is an Aristia, you might ask? In Greek historiography and the Iliad in particular, the term Aristia is used to describe a hero's single greatest accomplishment, during which he, inspired by a god, slays a great number of the enemy, often in order to deliver the hero's people from danger. Classicist Bruce Loudon, whose specialty is the Homeric epics, believes that many of the stories in Joshua and Judges are deliberately organized around such Aristias. The most common form of the Aristia in Greek literature is the duel, whereas the Bible more commonly features an exploit of one hero against many, with David and Goliath the notable exception. For example, the Spirit of Yahweh comes upon Othniel, who then defeats King Cushan Risteam, Judges 3:10, and upon Jephthah, who defeats the Ammonites, Judges 11:29-31. The Spirit of Yahweh also rushes upon Samson when he kills the lion, Judges 14:6, and again when he kills 1,000 Philistines, Judges 15:14-15. David's Gibborim, there's that word again, are renowned for simple triumphs. Shammah defeats an entire army of Philistines on his own through the power of Yahweh, 2 Samuel 23:11-12. Jashabim slays 800 men at one time, 2 Samuel 23:8. 1 Chronicles 11:11. Abishai kills 300 at once, 2 Samuel 23:18. Shamgar's feat of killing 600 Philistines seems to fit the same mold. Often, in an Aristia, the hero's weapon is unique in some way. In most biblical examples, the hero's weapon is also given special mention. Shamgar's ox goad, a spear-like weapon. Samson's donkey jaw. Jashabim's and Abishai's spears. David's sling, and so on.
Samson.
Samson is another hero of Judges with remarkable parallels to the character of Heracles, or Hercules, from Greek mythology. Both characters, of course, were primarily renowned for their superhuman strength. However, the similarities go well beyond mere strength. Like many Greek cultural heroes, Hercules was considered to be a demigod, with the human woman Alcmene as his mother and Zeus himself as his father. Divinity might not seem applicable here, but the text of Judges actually hints at divine parentage for Samson as well. In Judges 13, the barren wife of Manoah, the Danite, has two encounters alone with the angel of Yahweh, whom she thinks is simply a man at first. Quote, "The woman came and told her husband, 'A man of God came to me, and his appearance was like an angel of God, most awe-inspiring. I did not ask him where he came from, and he did not tell me his name.' Judges 13:6. And the angel of God came to the woman again. She was sitting in the field, and her husband Manoah was not with her. Judges 13:9. End quote. The angel tells her she is pregnant and will have a son, and gives special instructions regarding the boy's upbringing. Sure enough, all happens as the angel predicted. Many scholars believe there's a subtext of divine involvement in the birth, namely that the child is the offspring of the angel, or even of Yahweh himself. Zakovich and Shinen, in their well-known book on the suppression of mythological themes in the Bible, note that the angel is said to come to Samson's mother, using an expression that sometimes alludes to sex in the Bible. Furthermore, there is no positive statement in Judges that Samson was the natural son of Manoah, or that his parents had relations before his conception. Whether Samson was originally understood to be a semi-divine figure is an open question, but the possibility is intriguing. The Samson-Heracles similarities don't end there. Samson's first heroic deed in Judges 14 is the slaying of a lion with his bare hands. The first feat of Heracles, one of his famous 12 labors, was also to slay a lion barehanded. Another connection with Greek myth can be found in the puzzling appearance of a beehive in the lion's carcass left by Samson. This time, it concerns Aristeus, the first keeper of bees, As the legend goes, Aristeus's bees began to die as divine punishment for his accidental role in the death of Eurydice. Eurydice, another famous mythological character, had been bitten by a poisonous snake while Aristeus was chasing her. In order to get his bees back, Aristeus had to sacrifice 12 animals to the gods and leave their carcasses at the site of the sacrifice. Returning 3 days later, he found the carcasses full of bees, which he took back to his apiary. This odd story makes more sense than you might think if you are an ancient Greek, that is. According to Philip Wagenbaum, honey was considered to be a divine food in ancient Greece, similar to nectar and ambrosia, because it had already been cooked in the stomachs of bees and could not rot. The process of rotting, on the other hand, could be understood as nature's way of cooking meat. Thus, there was a logical connection in Greek thought between rotten meat and honey. What's also remarkable is that the 9th Penthean Ode by Pindar, a Greek poet from the 5th century BCE, associates Aristeus with Heracles. Mixing these two myths would provide all the elements of Samson's lion carcass of bees. It's also worth noting that Aristeus's mother, Cyrene, was famous for killing a lion single-handedly. Perhaps just coincidence, but it's another example of a Greek hero who kills a lion, this time connected to Samson via the bee story. The miraculous spring from which Samson also had a parallel in the Heracles legend, and it's possible, the 12 labors of Heracles, an allusion to the zodiac and the solar year, are echoed in Samson's name, which means, quote, little son, end quote. Like Heracles, Samson was a great lover, and also like Heracles, Samson was captured by foreigners and then slew his captors during their own religious celebrations. Heracles' descent from Danaea even recalls Samson's descent from Dan, a migratory tribe that appears to have its own connections with Greek legend. Even the early Christians equated Samson with Heracles in catacomb art. At the very least, if Samson is not directly based on Heracles, the two characters appear to come from a shared cultural sphere that was heavily Greek influenced. We have other evidence that writers of the Hellenistic era sought to incorporate legendary Greek characters into biblical stories. One Jewish or Samaritan author from around the 2nd century BCE, named Cleodemus, claimed that 2 of Abraham's sons accompanied Heracles in his expedition against Libya and Antaeus. According to the same legend, one of Abraham's granddaughters is supposed to have married Heracles himself.
Gideon.
After Samson, the most famous hero of Judges might be Gideon, or Jerubbaal, as he is also called. He is most famous for a feat in which he and 300 hand-picked men defeated the entire Midianite army of 120,000 warriors and saved Israel as a result. There is a very good Greek parallel to Gideon in the tale of Leonidas, the king of Sparta, who fought the Persian army at Thermopylae with just 300 warriors. A story well known in modern pop culture thanks to the movie 300. The nighttime attack of the Spartans, as told by Diodorus Siculus, is very similar to the nighttime attack of Gideon in Judges 7. In both cases, the enemy is taken by surprise and is so terrified that they attack and slaughter each other in the chaos. This is not the only connection between Leonidas and the Bible. Incidentally, during the Hellenistic period, some Jews believed that the Israelites and Spartans were both descended from Abraham. It was also said by Herodotus that Leonidas, Gideon of Sparta, was a descendant of Heracles. Perhaps this is connected to the aforementioned legend that Heracles married Abraham's granddaughter. At any rate, the link between Israel and Sparta is mentioned both 1 Maccabees 12, in 2 Maccabees 5:9, and in Josephus' Antiquities 12, 225-27. In 2 Maccabees, we are told that the Jewish high priest Jason fled to Sparta in 168 BCE in the hopes that his shared heritage with the Spartans would cause them to give him refuge. And according to 1 Maccabees, the 3rd century Spartan king Arius established a pact of friendship with the Hasmonean Jewish monarchy on account of their shared descent from Abraham. If the belief, however, false, of a familial connection between Israel and Sparta went back far enough, it's not entirely surprising that legends about Sparta's most famous king would be echoed in the tales of some of Israel's greatest legends.
Conclusion.
The examples just given are not comprehensive. Many more direct and indirect parallels and connections between the Bible and Greek myth and historiography can be shown. Some are more convincing than others. Some are so strong, however, that it's difficult to deny Greek influence on the later portions of the Old Testament. As Robert Carl Neuss puts it in his book Hellenism and the Primary History, quote, "Overall, the sheer magnitude of the examples commands our attention. One cannot simply dismiss all of these examples as sheer coincidences, nor can one casually say that such stories are common in folklore around the world. The number of the parallels preclude the possibility of coincidence, and one cannot find parallels in other literatures for all these parallel examples found in Greek and biblical literature." End quote. Historian Emmanuel Foe agrees that the Greek influence was a decisive factor in shaping many of the stories of the Pentateuch and Deuteronomistic history. He believes that the final arrangement of the Greek-inspired narratives in the Bible was carried out in Hasmonean Jerusalem by the Judean priest kings of the 2nd century, whose intent was to centralize religious and secular power in Jerusalem. Thus, we end up with a fascinating collection of stories inspired by the Greek gods and heroes of old inserted into a setting with a theological viewpoint that is so thoroughly Jewish and foreign to the Greek world, that of a Jewish nation with ancient Near Eastern roots attempting to reassert and reinvent itself after the Babylonian exile. I hope you've enjoyed this documentary. Please subscribe to the Inquisitive Bible Reader. The creator of that channel is Paul Davidson, who wrote this script today. MythVision and Paul have a lot in common, and we love diving into this further. If you appreciate this content, subscribe over on his channel and check out more links. Go show him that MythVision has sent you to show him some love for all the work he's produced here. You can also help support MythVision by joining our Patreon, become a YouTube member, drop a comment down below. Let us know what really got you excited. Are there any parts of this documentary that really made you think and go, wow, I have a lot more to learn? I feel that way as I create these documentaries. I'm sure that Paul from Inquisitive Bible Reader feels the same way as we study and produce these videos. Please help support us in our endeavor to keep bringing you history, wisdom, legend, myth, and uncovering the realities of the ancient books, especially the Bible. Thanks so much, and never forget, we are MythVision.